Hope you're all enjoying. Nice to give a lecture to you guys. Hope you're all having a wonderful evening in the Philippines right now. Sorry, today I'm wearing a Filipino shirt. It says here, andito tayo para sa isa't isa, which means we are here for each other. And I hope that all of you, always value community and always try and help each other in the circuit, even though it's very difficult in these times nowadays. So, I hope you're all having a great time, great evening. I will just say, guys, initially it was supposed to just be a lecture on political dynasties in general, but then I realized that I love my country so much, and the midterm elections just happened in the Philippines. So I was like, why not? Why not talk about the Philippines? Because I know about it the most anyways. Like, well, you guys don't go to this lecture for me to talk about different countries, because you could study that on your own. You can also study about political dynasties on your own, no matter what. But I think the Philippines is a particularly valuable experience and case study, which I will explain later on, that has very, very good contrast and very, very good things that you could learn from, not only because of its colonial history, which could contribute to political dynasties, but also because I think that related to any other political dynasty in any other country, right? The fact that the Philippines has very weak political parties makes the role of political dynasties very, very, very much so important. Like, I would argue that, yeah, you might have the Nehrus and the Gandhis, you might have all the other, the Aung San Suu Kyis of the world in any other country, but the reason why, you would argue that political dynasties are significantly different in the way that they function is because of, the very weak political context that the Philippines has, which is why I would argue it was more vulnerable for, you would say, maybe authoritarian capture, or even like significant swings in popularity, which otherwise take away dynastic politics in superb ways, like insane ways that you could eventually realize and talk about. So it's a very good experimental ground, it's a very good experimental ground, which is why, I think Maria Ressa, who was the Nobel Peace Prize awardee, said that they used the Philippines as a model as a testing ground for social media radicalism and misinformation, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which propelled Duterte into power in 2016. That was a perfect testing ground that eventually was used later on in other democracies around the world, like the US, for example, or even during Brexit, which is where, a lot of these things were tested with larger populations compared to the Philippines. So I just wanted to say that if you think that the Philippines is not a valuable example, then, just leave the lecture. Just leave the lecture. And I'm going to just keep on talking about it because I love the Philippines. And I'll do that no matter what. I'll do a few announcements before we begin our presentation for today. The first announcement I wanted to say for everyone, just because this is being recorded as well, is that please, ladies and gentlemen, please acknowledge and remember that we are at 2.99K subscribers. So within this lecture right now, we are at the precipice of finally reaching 3,000 subscribers. And that's thanks to all of your support. Please do that. Please subscribe now, because there's a video I wanted to highlight with respect to today, which is quite valuable, actually. I'll just talk about this for a while, since it will probably be a little bit relevant. The first thing I wanted to say is that, I set a lot of Philippine motions which talk a lot about political dynasties implicitly, right? I talked about this motion in 2023, which is about military pensions, Bongbong Marcos motions on military pensions. This one was interest of BBM to fully cooperate with an ICC probe on the drug war of the previous Duterte administration. I basically predicted that Duterte would get arrested like 2 years before it happened. So I'm proud about that. And then number 3, that Bongbong Marcos would take a position of strategic ambiguity with respect to defending the Philippines' territorial claims on the South China Sea, which I actually did not necessarily predict, because he eventually started asserting the Philippines' territorial rights more explicitly, even at the detriment of trade ties with China, most specifically because Duterte, during his administration, was very buddy-buddy with China, and he tried courting Xi Jinping to try and give him amnesty or certain temporary protection in China so that he wouldn't get imprisoned by the ICC. But then BBM was like, nah, not gonna happen, buddy, not gonna happen. And then he arrested him immediately, which is why it was in his interest, because BBM and his family was supported by the United States historically by different administrations, like the Nixon administration in the 1970s and the 1960s. He was indebted to the US, and that is why he was it was in his strategic interest to just be anti-China at the time. Like, there's no reason to be anti-China other than the fact that he is specifically pro-US, and it is in the interest to take away Duterte at the time. So I just wanted to say that all of these motions, which intuitively just seem like, oh, they're just debates about BBM in general, they're almost always about dynastic politics. And that's why I wanted to just emphasize that if you think about the Philippines and you use it in an example, it is always very good, always a perfect opportunity for you to talk about the role of dynastic politics in how it shapes policy, how it shapes poverty alleviation, how it shapes other related welfare policy or agricultural policy. All these things are related to the role that dynastic politics does with respect to the national government, which is our things that we're going to discuss for today. All right. So hopefully by the end of the lecture, you're going to know a little bit about the Philippines, but also we're going to reach 3,000 subscribers. All right, game. We're going to proceed. We're going to proceed, my friends. Let's go. So this is the lecture. This is the lecture. I created this lecture in a Google document, and then it's going to be given to you guys. It's going to be provided. No worries at all if you have trouble copying notes. But the way I give lectures is I just keep on talking, and I just keep on giving more and more examples off the top of my head, and I try and explain it along the way, and I will always tie back to what is on the slide or what is currently on screen. If you have any questions, I would encourage you to hold your questions until the very, very end. Make a very, very good, meaty question. Have a good question that you could use, and then send it later on if you are very curious. I'll say that I'm not a political scientist, right? But I am an economist, and I think the good thing about economics is that you become very interested about trying to look for very strong, overwhelming causal reasons for things to be true or not. Which doesn't apply all the time in political science, but we try to come up with some factor which is overwhelming and strong enough that we could try and isolate and discuss in this lecture, which is what we're going to do. We're going to try and discuss it in terms of some models which are relevant to this presentation. Game. Let's do it, my friends. So I'll get right into it. So the outline of this lecture will be as follows. I'm going to talk about three things. Number one, the EDSA Revolution of 1986, which is relatively one of the most popular local revolutions that toppled the dictator peacefully in the region. I think the reason why it's historically important, internationally significant, is because internationally, the significance of the EDSA Revolution is that it was the church at the time, and of course, you guys know that the Philippines is a very religious country, Catholic majority. At the time, there was an authoritarian, dictator that was in power at the time. It was the father of Bongbong Marcos. His name was Ferdinand Marcos. He was a dictator. He implemented martial law. The military was in power. They were being asked to shoot down civilians on the streets, and they were ordered to shoot down civilians on the streets. But then the Cardinal Sin, funnily, his name is Cardinal Sin. Hope everyone gets the joke because it's a Catholic joke. At the time, Cardinal Sin goes on the radio, and then he's like, don't shoot the civilians, go protest and topple the dictator. So it was one of the only times when the Philippine Catholic Church intervened in politics and directly told the civilians to go and oust a sitting administration in power. And that is, we had all these nuns. There's a lot of imagery and a lot of photos that you can see. You go in like, you literally see all these people, all these nuns, all these, young students, all these, civil rights activists, everyone, going on the streets, going up to the barrels of guns, and then, all these young soldiers that were ordered to go and shoot these civilians just couldn't do it. They didn't have the heart to do it. And so that spurred a lot of other revolutions, arguably, across the world, which is like, all these other revolutions called like the Orange Revolution, the Purple Revolution, all the, whatever, because the EDSA Revolution was notably called, it's also called the Yellow Revolution because it was led by, or at least had a spearhead of putting into power Cory Aquino later on, who is also part of a political dynasty, but we'll discuss that in a while. The second question I'm going to tackle is the question of dynastic politics. So we're going to start from the middle, which is EDSA Revolution. That's the middle. I would call that the middle of Philippine history, relatively, to be the case, between modern history and like colonial history, which is like, all the past in like the 1800s, the 1940s, and before that. And then talk about dynastic politics, going from the beginning. How did we get here? Which is, why did oligarchic politics persist during and even after colonialism? Look at the structural reason behind that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the Marcos Duterte conflict, starting from the end, which is the question of why do political dynasties persist in weak democracies? Specifically, to be the case, like, why do the poor vote for political dynasties which directly cause more poverty? Like, it is empirically the case that all the literature says that most political dynasties have a strong correlation with inequality, aggressive inequality in the poorest of regions. You look at a place like Mindanao, where, southern Philippines, where you see that, 90-80% of congressional governing seats or governor seats are all held by families who have like 3 or 2 positions in the same line of local government. And those are also the places that have the poorest people in the Philippines as well. And we're going to look at that. And then later on, we're going to, tie that with how that was tied to elite politics, elite, bargaining for power. And specifically with respect to the anti-colonial movement and how political dynasties came to rise as a consequence of shifts in transitions of power, such as when authoritarians fall apart and then new dynasties come into power, or also when colonial powers fall apart and then new alternative technocratic dynastic politics dominates afterwards. And then, you tie this in with, the post-colonial rhetoric being one of uniting the state, but also unintendedly, promoting a nationalism that is very familial in nature because you don't trust anyone else other than the families that you have strong kinships to, which is what this entire lecture is about, right? That if you are going to take anything from this lecture and you want to leave after now, and then you want to just know what the gist is that families, right? Families, clans have strong, bargaining chips in local elections because of their, the assertion of independence given a very elitist national government. And it is their means of negotiating for limited representation and autonomy so that they could be able to, to some extent, empower the interests of the people that are tied to those families, which are all their neighbors and the people that live in the local areas. Like I just wanted to just talk about the story for a while. I was looking at my genealogy. You can look at your genealogy. A lot of people in the Philippines, you look at their last name, and then you look at your history. Like how far do you go back, right? How far does that go back? Because there's a popular Facebook post that was circulating during the elections of the midterm elections. People were asking, how the hell is Duterte so popular? Like, how the hell is Duterte so popular? Literally, the drug war happened. He killed tens of thousands of people, poor people, including people in his own, communities. And he ordered that. He said it in public. He admitted to it. He even went on the National Congress and then said, I will take full responsibility for all the killings. And then he's like a martyr. He's trying to portray himself in that way. And then you're asking, why does the majority still support him, right? And it's 80% approval rating. And even his daughter, who threatened to assassinate the president of the Philippines, has a 67% approval rating. And if you look at the midterm elections now, all of his friends that he appointed into power, the number 1, number 3, number 4 position, all of them went, the senator positions, all of them went to Duterte-aligned people. Whereas you have someone like Marcos, he has a father who was in power long ago. He also lost significant popularity because he was deposed from power. And then suddenly he had a comeback, but then suddenly now he's not popular anymore, even though he's already president and he's also the one that took credit for taking away Duterte from power. How does that happen? And then there was this Facebook post that I saw, which is that if you go to Mindanao and you ask people in Davao City, everyone is always going to be proud about like, I'm related to Duterte in some way. They say that I'm related to Duterte in some way. He's my cousin's godfather. And then they're like, yeah, it's such a close thing. Everyone does that in the Philippines. I'm sure to some extent they might do that in India or any other developing country, but in the Philippines, I will not understate it. It's a huge thing. So I was looking at my genealogy. People don't know how to pronounce my last name because it has an Enya, which is a special character in Spain. and my last name is Spanish. It's Alcaneses. It's pronounced Alcaneses. And you look back at the genealogy of that. It's literally just because when the Spanish colonial regime started trying to indoctrinate people to go and convert into Catholicism, one of the requirements people had was to change their name, so they could forgo their, indigenous identities or whatever last name they had before, and then adopt a new name. People didn't know what their last name would be, so they would put X, and then they'd be called Cruz because that's what a cross is, or otherwise they'd be named after certain places in Spain, such as, Alcaneses came from a place called like Alcaneses in like Spain or something. And so even though we don't have anyone that's like Spanish in our line, people found pride in like having that last name because it's like, oh, that's status that I'm associated with some family that is very prestigious, that is associated with some genealogy that, that has this long familial line. So there's all these ancestral homes that are very, very valuable, and, that they talk about historical heritage. And that's also tied with politics, inevitably as a consequence, right? So I just wanted to say that because if there's one lesson that you want to take from this lecture, it's just that, right? It's just that family is so important. Family is love, and that it contributes to inequality, but also independence, and also this, push and pull between different people in power, people power revolution, in this specific case, in the context of very weak democratic politics. Game. We'll now proceed, my friends. EDSA Revolution of 1986. So there are three things that you need to know about the Philippines. The first is that it has weak political parties. The second is that it has strong anti-colonial rhetoric. And the third is that there's a concept called Imperial Manila that has developed, over a long period of time. This discontentment against elite imperial politics in Manila. Manila being the, what do you call this? The capital of the Philippines. Not only the colonial capital under Spanish administration, and also the American administration, and also the Japanese administration, but even until the national administration until today. And then, all these other things. So let's go to the first one, right? What do we mean by weak political parties? Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because there's no easy answer as to why we have weak political parties in the Philippines. You could argue it's because of the fact that people defer a lot to families, and then you're going in this circle, in this spin that they defer to families. That's why political parties are weak, and then they become weaker because of political families, right? But if you want to go back, really, really back, as to why political parties are weak, it is because they were almost always just puppets that were administered by colonial regimes so that they could just be placeholders for the interests of colonial governments, or also, the landed gentry or people that owned land in Congress and in Senate. So for example, I'll give a very concrete one. When we were liberated from liberated from the colonial regime of Spain, all the way back in like 1896. So we had Spain as our colonial administrator for like 500 years, 300 years, 330 years specifically. And we got, we had our own independence. The Spain, deferred a lot because of its administration. Spain is a faraway country. It can't like always administer over like everything all the time. Like it can't send new ships all the time because it's literally people are gonna die. So they deferred a lot to people that were, that were there. So they were like, oh, we're going to particularly empower particular families, elite families that will be in power. And so they're like, oh, so now if we want to court particular independence movements, we have to court the elite of those independence movements, which is why people like our first president, Aguinaldo, right? Aguinaldo, when he handed over power, independence, and we became independent afterwards. Essentially, America just had to go to the Treaty of Paris and then just be like, yeah, we'll just buy you, and then we'll give you safe haven in Hong Kong, and that's what they promised someone like Aguinaldo at the time. And then he said that, oh, I'll allow you guys like more seats in the new administration that is going to be a transitional. We're gonna white man's burden, help you guys become a democracy. You guys can be in power. And so Aguinaldo was like, yeah, it's a great deal. It's a great deal. I don't have to be part of a failing, collapsing Spanish administration because they're losing a lot of money. I could just now go with the Americans. And so the Americans are like, yeah, it's a little bit easy for us to just trust these people, like these families. And then we just keep on moving on and on. So they would have labels for the political parties, right? The Liberal Party, the Nationalista Party, the Democratic Party, heck, even arguably the Socialist Party or whatever. But no ideology was ever fully cemented or concretized or even developed in a sense because they deferred a lot to those appointees. And then because it was more transactional, you had to get campaign financing from people who were already in power before. You can't form a cohesive political party unless you were reliant on a political dynasty that was previously in power before. And so there were no solid political parties. Like arguably, when we talk about the EDSA Revolution of 1986, people talk about the Liberal Party, who was run by the Aquino administration at the time, or the Aquino family at the time. And what I want to just say is that was not a liberal revolution, right? People might say it was a liberal revolution. We had a constitution that eventually tried to enshrine this particular dynastic provision, which would say that, we don't want political dynasties in power. But Cory Aquino, who was the wife of Ninoy Aquino, who was assassinated by the Marcos administration, which prompted the EDSA revolution to happen. Cory Aquino was just a housewife, and then she ran for power, and then she became in power because of her name and association with that, and because of it's the image, right? Like that image was so powerful, and that image of peace, and trying to move away from like the Marcoses and all of that. It was like, I'm gonna make this constitutional provision, which is like, it's a new beginning. We're gonna go away from like this constitution that allowed Marcos, the Ferdinand Marcos, to like be in power for like 20 years, right? Because he had martial law and he was in power for so long, right? And he was even propped up by the US. So it was this mingling of anti-US rhetoric, anti-Marcos rhetoric that prompted Cory Aquino to just be like, we're gonna ban political dynasties. But really, it was just there. It was just a constitutional provision, but it was never actualized into a meaningful legislation because Aquino herself and her family was associated with, a merging of two families as well, which is the Aquino and Coangco family and dynasties, who owned a lot of agricultural land and, abused their workers, had human rights violations, had, the Coconut Association and all that other stuff, and eventually allowed them to stay in power for a very, very long time. Again, associated with weak political parties, with association to strong anti-colonial rhetoric. And I want to just elaborate this a little bit more. Why did the US support a lot of dictatorships in Asia? We know this already, guys. Everyone knows this. It is because of communism. It is because it was easy to defer to dictatorships as a means for you to try and consolidate military forces that would strongly, associate it with the US administration, get funding from it, implement martial law in their respective nations, and then directly kill opposition parties in the name of anti-communism or in the name of, democracy. And so, you had all these administrations in the US being like, yeah, Marcos, he's a US kind of guy. He's kind of nice. And we kind of like him because he's also anti-communist. Why was Marcos anti-communist? Because he just needed an excuse to be able to cement more military power, because when he borrowed a lot of money for corruption purposes, you can easily search this, right? You search Imelda Marcos and shoes, you're going to see all of the shoes that they laundered and, kept. And, when they eventually had the revolution in 1986, they went to the Malacanang Palace, which is the presidential palace. And then they saw like all of these, grand troves of money that even now are still not recovered in full. Like there's a lot of ill-gotten wealth that hasn't been recovered by the Marcos family. But even then, back then, right, people were like, we're okay with supporting Marcos because he's anti-communist. And so they gave him a lot of money. He implemented martial law to try and, move away from the excuse of a failing economy and rising inflation in the US. And then specifically, that ended up, causing a lot of discontentment with the US administration, because now it's like, oh, dude, this guy's he's kind of going off the rails, isn't he? Because he's becoming a dictator and it's going to go into a revolution. And then the US had this entire debate, which is already declassified, by the way, but you can search this. The US had an entire internal debate on whether or not they would support the EDSA revolution and give them, power, because it was noted that Ninoy Aquino, who's the guy that came back to the Philippines and got assassinated. Before he got assassinated, he went to the US, and then he was like, guys, he talked in the Senate, and he was like, this guy's a dictator. Don't support him. You should support me. I'm going to try and fight him in the next election. In effect, he actually just wanted to be a dictator as well. And then he just wanted to try and, help lead the revolution to take away Marcos from power. He goes in the plane. He does the speech and saying, I'm willing to die for the Filipino. And then everyone's proud about that. And then he goes down from the plane and then he dies. He gets shot in the head. And then he falls on the ground. And then people get mad. And then the revolution happens. And then boom, revolution, freedom, dynasties in power again. So there's this rhetoric associated with it, right? That there's frustration that dynasties court essentially neo-colonial or colonial powers because it is essential for a weak state like the Philippines, because they got nothing for them, which is why you could argue Duterte, during the period where he was like having significant discontentment with Trump and Obama, across those administrations, he was like, I need to be buddy with China, because he had no one to support him a lot. And that's when China funded the most infrastructure projects in depth in the Philippines at the time. And that's also when the US was forced to pull away from its military bases in the Philippines, because it had a military base. Like I live near a former military base in the Philippines. It was a naval base where they recruited a lot of it was an Air Force base, but also functioned as a nearby naval port, wherein they would recruit a lot of Filipinos to serve in the Navy, which is why a lot of them ended up going to the U.S. Navy, for example, in our part. The last thing I wanted to mention is that it's also associated with Imperial Manila. And so, again, you go back to the Treaty of Paris, you go back to Intramuros, you go back to the handovers of power that are reliant on colonial institutions and colonial administrations for power. Dynasties court them because it is very difficult to sustain a national government without neo-colonial help. What was necessary was that you had to empower specifically that family, and that family that was in power in Manila, right? That family that was in power in the national government. And that's why, when that government gets a lot of funding, it does unintendedly cause a lot of discontentment in many other provinces that otherwise were excluded from those negotiations. One of those parties, arguably, definitely was Mindanao. Right? Mindanao is an entire huge region devoted for many different provinces. One of that is the Davao region, which Duterte was relatively in control of because he was the mayor of Davao City for literally 20 years. He was the mayor for 20 years. And his family has always been mayor and vice mayor and governor at the time. Literally, Duterte, even though he's in The Hague, he won the mayor election in Davao City, even though he's in prison. That's how insane it is. And that's because, again, if you guys go back in history, Marcos trying to fight the communists, trying to fight opposition parties, trying to gain the favor of the US. Who are the people that he killed the most, right? That he targeted the most? Many administrations targeted Muslim Mindanao because they were the easiest scapegoats for the rise in terrorism, the rise in communism associated with terrorism, because they were also called terrorists, and also because they were significantly poor. And that already bred all of this civil discontentment. And they were the ones that were most likely to clamor for independence, and as a consequence of the growing militarism in the area. And so Mindanao had no one from the national government. Who could they rely on? Warlords, families, political dynasties who were already entrenched with their own private armies and militias, and were the ones that were already extracting taxes from the local governments, but also forcing them to vote in favor of them, but also giving the same public services that would get them recruited as part of those same militias and those same administrations that would keep them in power for a very long time. Like work in the farms, work in those neo-colonial institutions, which were essentially just labor, slave camps in Mindanao, right? Functionally, this is arguably the best that they could have asked for if the national government was literally sending the soldiers to go and start killing them and shooting and destroying their entire property, taking away their land, taking away their resources, killing all the indigenous peoples in these areas, and then saying that it's because of communism. But it was more nuanced than that. It was more nuanced than that because of that poverty situation that we were talking about. Okay? And Imperial Manila was the entire narrative behind this. It's not only just because of Mindanao, it's to an extent also applied in many other areas, because the Philippines, I would argue, compared to many other nations around the world, is a nation that is very hard to travel around, because it's a lot of islands, it's a lot of places that are separated from each other, and it is geographically easier to defer to local governments that would administer over them in that case, which is why there's this push and pull between the national government, the local government, because it is not a federal state, right? It's not a federal state. There's been a lot of talks about federalism being pulled in around and about, but that has obviously been delayed and had a lot of difficulty in being pushed forward because of the risk that it might unintendedly just worsen the political dynasty situation in these areas. Okay, game. That's everything associated with 1986, guys. I just wanted to say that if you wanted to search more about the People Power Revolution 1986, what you need to understand is that you had the Marcos administration, who was in power for many, many years, failed, became corrupt, significantly corrupt, very, very, very bad, courted the US, eventually was opposed for all the reasons associated with that, brought in instead the Aquino Coanco family into power through Cory Aquino, brought in a lot of dynastic politics as a consequence of that as well, new individual families that wanted to vie for power. Many coups d'etats happened as a consequence during the next administrations, and that is why it was very, very difficult to form a very centralized government system that was not reliant on a political family. Okay? We go on to the second one. Now, having said that, it should hopefully become a little bit easier for me now to discuss the role of dynastic politics associated with that, right? Now, when you look at all of these families, right, all of these families that are currently in power, right, I could give you all the last names that you want. I'll just give very few. I'll give very, very few last names so that you don't have to be overwhelmed with all of these Spanish-sounding names. You'll need to remember three things. Number one, that there are colonial caciques and the policy of attraction under the US administration that historically allowed the government to be very reliant on dynastic politics. Second, that the government, the national government, as a consequence of the things that I mentioned earlier, had to be reliant on this careful balance of decentralization and the tolerance of fat dynasties to administer over local regions. And number three, that this propelled what you would call the stationary bandit theory. Bandit being that they're bad people because they steal, but stationary because they're not going to steal more from where they're currently located. That's why there's a association, which is that, the Dutertes, they're going to just stay in the Davao area anyways. Surely they're not going to try and take over Cebu or Manila. They're only going to stay in Davao because they're stationary. That's the logic, that they have a vested incentive for long-term economic and political control in the area, which unintendedly might mitigate the worst excesses of poverty that might have happened otherwise if they were not the family that was in power. Okay, game, we do this. Number one, colonial caciques and the policy of attraction. So, Spanish administration. Spain relied on local families. They were called the Principalia. So, they were the elite families that controlled natural resources and agricultural systems. They were the ones that you relied on for translation purposes. They relied on them for education. They were the ones that also helped spearhead the, what do you call this? The Catholicization. No, the proselytization program in the Philippines, wherein you would get a family to go and convert to Catholicism, and then everyone else in the community does so as well because, they're the big family anyways, and so I should do so as well. And so they relied on those kinship ties to try and allow for that relative independence and that relative trust in that. So unintendedly, what you would argue from the colonial cacique system is that it propelled rapid education among elite groups, but also, arguably, it propelled the rapid development of the anti-colonial regime, which is that you had all of these rival, families that wanted to get power, but were also very well educated, but were like, hey, why are we not in power? I'm very smart. And so that's when they started, thinking about, oh, well, we should try and be our own independent state, because it's illogical for us to be reliant on a very failing Spanish administration. And so, we can't be reliant on these bad political families that are in power. And so there was the Principalia fight against like all these other, elite groups. They were called the Ilustrados, but they could be called like many other groups, like the middle class or whatever. But basically, these were educated groups of individuals who went abroad for education, experiences of, what foreign administrations were like. And then they go back to the Philippines and they're like, well, I'm ready to take control and start governing on our own. And so that's why they opposed the easiest scapegoats of that, which were all of these caciques that were in power. Number two, when America was the administration, well, what is the difference? America wanted to have a traditional government. They ended up having a puppet government into power. They tried having a Senate. They had like a copied constitution. And the way that they tried to defer to that instead is that they're like, yeah, you know what we'll do? We're gonna just rely on trying to limit voting to those who are only educated. And so that is where it was very easy for those that were already privileged by the selection policy of the US, and the appointment policy of that. For them, the ones who already know English, who already are very well educated, who already owned land previously, and who also were the ones that helped, give secrets to the US, and then eventually were handed over power by the US administration after Spain ceded power. Those were the same individuals that ended up running the administration later on. We were all US sympathetic people who had power for a very, very long time, up until the point when the US started, going crazy, and then started, committing human rights violations by, particularly like, torturing, all these Filipinos, and also, forcing them to join the military regime so that they could fight for their wars on their own behalf. And then it came to the point where everyone was like, U.S. not kind of good all the time, but then Japan came, and then Japan was so much worse. Japan only administered for 3 years, absolutely destroyed Manila, burned it completely, actually, alongside all these other libraries, all these other churches, and all these other things. And so they had no choice. The anti-colonial regime against Japan had no choice but to ally with all these other U.S. prisoners that were also imprisoned in the Philippines at the time during World War II. And so it was this mingling of like this relative U.S. sympathy, because they're like, yeah, we hate Japan, that facilitated U.S. control even after Japan eventually like lost the war. And then eventually the US was like, yeah, because we were all buddy, we can now have our US military bases and we're going to keep developing it more. The Philippines had no other option but continue bringing in more US people into the Philippines, all their soldiers, all the expats. And then eventually, those were all those people that ended up mingling with all the elite families that already spoke English, that was already very educated. And those were the families that became very, very, very rich. Right? Those are the people. Those are the people that eventually became like, arguably very, very liberal, very, very, very educated, very, very, very progressive, but also the same ones that owned all these industries that the US wanted to invest in. Okay? Game. That's one. It was necessary as part of colonial legacy. Number two, but when the Philippines eventually became independent, which is to say that it was expensive for the US to administer over them for too long, Philippines was on its own, Philippines, poor country, the national government had to deal with the problem of, well, now we have no other national government, right? We have no strong military control. We had no means for us to, centralize the government. So they had to rely on local governments that were decentralized, so that they could, bargain for votes, actually. Because if you wanted to win a national election, you needed to win all the provinces who had lots and lots of people, right? There's huge numbers of populations in, the north, the south, in the Visayas region, which is the middle of the Philippines, right? And essentially, that's where it became easier for people to hoard and bargain for money locally, Because it's like, I'm a family in certain province that is very influential. If you wanted to run for the Senate or wanted to run for the or national government, like the Senate or the presidency or whatever, then you needed to get favor from my area. And I would give you my votes. I would tell my people in my area to start voting for you. I'd align with you. And that was transactional. For you to get my vote, you have to give me a bigger portion of the national budget so that I could do whatever I want. Decentralization gave me a lot of discretion over fiscal policy and many government projects which I could put under my name in the area, which I could use to develop using public funds, but also for corruption reasons. And so it's like, yeah, you know what? It's easy for me to just hold that money, take credit for it, and then also eventually win more votes because of this system. And that is why eventually it was the case that whenever I would implement a government project, it would always be beneficial to the industries that I was already invested in, which are the things that were already beneficial for the area in the first place. It got a lot of employment, it got a lot of votes, it also got a lot of people out of poverty, arguably, in these areas. Right? So these are the examples, right? The Revillas of Cavite, the D's of Isabela, and the Enrile family in Cagayan. All of these things are very simple, very realistic examples wherein it's like it's easy for those people to elect people from those families into power because they're the ones that provided the most employment and the most public projects, which were already bargained for from the national government. Because no matter who's in power, by the way, anyone who ends up winning and getting your votes would still need to give more of your national budget to that area, which is why eventually, right, it's independent. That dynasty doesn't need to aspire for more. Like, there's no need. Like, there's no need to aspire for more if you're already like, you're the top dog. It's like literally like big, big fish in a small pond. Except, right, you're talking about a political dynasty making more babies who would eventually be in power within that administration. Okay, game. The last thing I wanted to say then is the stationary bandit theory. Right, there is the question of what makes a political dynasty more benevolent versus less benevolent. I don't think this is necessarily an appropriate question. It's never about whether they are a benevolent or not benevolent dynasty. It is almost always a question of what are their interests with respect to the national government, right? I'll give a good case study. A good case study would be that the Osmeñas of Cebu, right? Yeah, Cebu is like an area in like the middle of the Philippines. It's neither the north, neither the south. It's Cebu is like one of the richest areas in the Philippines because it's functioning like a second capital. Because it has its own airport, it has its own it was also a center point of um Catholicism in the Philippines as well, which is why the Spanish regime invested a lot because they believe that there was a Jesus miracle that happened there, and then so they're like, yeah, let's invest a lot of money there, and then it eventually became its own full fledged like area that was super developed by Spain because they really believed Jesus was there, and then he was so powerful, and then he conducted a lot of miracles. Even though, by the way, those miracles were just whitewashed stories that were used to cover up the genocide that was conducted by the Spanish regime at the time. But essentially, a lot of good stuff in Cebu. And so a lot of industries were supported there at the time. And so the Osmeñas were one of those families that were eventually the ones that were under the colonial cacique, right? Eventually all they were supported by the policy of attraction. And eventually some of them eventually aspired for national office, but eventually became, vice president, eventually became in the national government, but eventually retired because of term limits and then eventually went back to Cebu. The argument that many scholars say is that there is no reason to aspire beyond your own geography because of the potential conflict with another family, which could lead to another resource war of attrition, which is very, very bad for your family because you can't spend on campaign financing that is unproductive. But also it is the case that because you are invested with particular business partners in the area, you are more willing to just stay in your area as opposed to expand because you know that long-term development in this area is a more certain guarantee for you. And that's why, they had arguably one of the best, rapid developments in the past, 20 years 30 years, because of this concentration of wealth and concentration of elite power that was, exchanged between all of these families. Whether or not that it is overall good for inequality is not true. It's not necessarily the case that they, improved inequality, right? Like by reducing inequality. It is the case though that overall economic development was more rapid in these areas than otherwise would be the case. Um, the thing I wanted to just mention is that this is where we go into the debate on like limitations on political dynasties, because I know that, like, for example, India has this like anti party hopping, law or legislation that was like talked about a lot before, and probably to some extent is implemented. And this is where you talk about the weak political party system in the Philippines. We don't have that. We don't have that, which is why it's very easy for political families to always shift political parties from each other. But it really just is not productive to have an anti-party hopping clause, because there is no strong political party in the first place. And of course, that's the argument because of the stationary bandit theory, right? Because they don't even identify by parties in the first place. Like the Osmanias are neither liberal, neither conservative. They're literally just very, very good businessmen that have been in power for a very, very long time. Okay. I need to say that because there's the argument, which is that it is economical, it is productive, precisely because they're not affiliated with any particular ideology, and that is why it is better long lasting and it is more long term. Like it's like less, it's less subservient to like the changes of the times and ideology that might, cause more, politicking, which is like worse in states where there are two party systems or multi party systems. But this one, it's kind of like, oh, but it's transactional, and that's why patronage politics is actually very good as a comparative, because of its business interests that are more well vested in the region. Which is why crony politics, right, arguably is not bad, because crony politics, in the way it manifests in the Philippines, is technocratic. Okay. I wanted to mention this because when the first Marcos guy, the dad of BBM, his name was Ferdinand Marcos. He was the dictator that was deposed later on. When he eventually took power, right? He took power all the way back in like the 1930s or something like that. And then he, sorry, I'm getting it wrong. In the 1940s, 1950s, whatever. All those administrations afterwards in power for like 20 years. And then, this is immediately after the US took away. It left, right? It led them to be independent. Marcos was one of the families that was the first administrations in power. And so you think of it like this, right? At the time, Marcos was like, I need to cement my family into power in the national government for a very long time. I cannot allow any other long-standing Spanish-associated family, because they don't have the same vested interests like the U.S. administrations that have been in power, because they chose me. I don't want them in power. So what did Marcos do? Marcos Sr. do? What he did was that he started going and asking the U.S. to go and say, can you offer scholarships to a lot of my relatives, all of my buddies, all of these guys that are like, they're not that successful yet, but they're going to be good businessmen in the future. And so the US was like, yeah, I'll give them scholarships. So like all the Rockefeller scholarships, all of these like scholarships that gave them like, let them study at the University of Chicago, University of Yale, all these things was part of that project, like better US and Philippine relations. And then they were the first people that became the economic advisors of Marcos when he ended up becoming president. And so those people, right, very technocratic, very well skilled, very good businessmen, but also eventually, only loyal to Marcos, which is why crony politics in that sense was technocratic, but very, very, very dynastic. Okay? And that's why it's very, very different with any other initiative that otherwise you would say, right? Like you could develop political parties to the extent that they could develop their own skills on their own and get campaign financing independent of that. But that's not possible. Not possible under a system like this one. Okay? I wanted to say that because the context of Marcos doing that, continued for many other administrations in the future. Arguably, Duterte did the same. which is why a lot of his administrators in the cabinet visited China a lot, because they gave him information, they gave him data, they gave him all of these things that would help him, develop Chinese businesses in many, many, many different areas that were relatively poor, so that they could improve offshore gambling projects, but have a lot of employment, but also have a lot of kickbacks to the Chinese. And then suddenly we had this scandal many, many years, sorry, just last year, 2 years ago, wherein a lot of Chinese spies were, flooding the Philippines, causing a lot of problems as a consequence. And that was because of the Duterte administration being reliant on technocracy from the Chinese administration at the time as well. Okay. We now go on to the present day. The present day obviously is the Marcos Duterte conflict, which is the Dutertes of Mindanao and the Marcos of Solid North. I already talked about the context of the Dutertes being associated with Muslim Mindanao. Duterte himself is not necessarily a Muslim, but he is associated with a Muslim dominant area, which is why, like, yeah, I mean, to an extent, right? The Catholics tried to colonize and have influence there as well, but they were very limited. Some Jesuits were very successful, like Ateneo de Davao, for example. But largely speaking, most of Mindanao is still Muslim. And I already talked about the context of anti-colonial resistance and anti-imperial Manila resistance, but specifically with respect to Dutertes, the reason why they are very popular is because of, and I will say this, because of the drug war and because of the association of being tough on crime. You have a context where it was already unstable. There were many terrorists. There were many organized crime syndicates that would take in power, many warlords that were fighting for power in the area, many other rival political dynasties. You get Duterte, who becomes a mayor, and then he's like, I am going to empower my own death squad. I'm going to start killing all of these organized crime syndicates that power drugs. I'm going to kill all these terrorists. I don't care about what the national government thinks. I'm going to do whatever I want. For a state, for a city that was literally at risk of worse forms of violence, you would trust the local police. That's the perspective of people in Mindanao. And again, that was a consequence of historical injustice, not just under the Dutertes, but because of past administrations. Which is why for Duterte, it's easy for him to run for government, national government, at a period in time in 2016, when, by the way, at the time, it was an Aquino who was in power, literally the son of Cory Aquino who was in power. And at the time, it was very, very, very difficult for the Aquinos to like repair their image, because again, that's histories of coup d'etats, histories of failures of administration because of weak governance. Duterte's being an outsider of politics, and because for every other political family, it was literally just preferable to just side with Duterte over any other political family instead. They were like, yeah, let's prop up this guy because he's gonna fund the national government more. He's willing to just empower all these other decentralized families that were already in power for a very long time. One of the biggest campaigning projects of Duterte was to push for federalism. Right? He advocated for decentralization even more so, which all the political families were like okay with. So you advocated for the drug war, which was already good enough to get a lot of them, the poor and the middle class. But he also advocated for like, decentralization, which made it easier for other people to, vote for him into power. You look at the Marcoses. The Marcoses, right, again, relative to the case in which the Aquinos have been in power for a very, very long time, they had a very bad image because of the 1986 revolution. But for many, many years, they had an echo chamber in the solid north, in Ilocos, the Ilocos region, wherein they would continuously fund disinformation programs, which by the way, they got help from from the Dutertes from, where they would literally just fund alternative textbooks, alternative, narratives, influencers online, flood that on social media, and then basically for the 2022 election would unite and come up with their own coalition, which is called the Unity Team, right? It's literally called the Unity Team, where they would try and unseat, or just beat out any other opposition. So everyone, literally everyone that won that election was, to an extent, pro administration, pro Marcos, pro Duterte to some extent. Um, there are many arguments, by the way, that people and scholars have said, which is that Duterte didn't really need Marcos to be allied with him. Like he could have just beat him on his own. But I don't think that's necessarily always true. Duterte, you don't know if he would always stay in power forever. You don't know whether or not he would it would be detrimental if he was against Marcos, right? And so it was just easier, politically convenient, for him to create an alliance with Marcos so that his daughter would go into power, maybe later on in the long run. So there was the promise that Sara Duterte, who would be the daughter, would go into power later on, but run for office. But what did the Marcoses do? Because they're freaking traitors. They started they started getting Duterte imprisoned. They started, you know, an impeachment trial against Sara Duterte. And might, they're going to file for that. It's already going to be, the trial's going to start soon. And, arguably, it's the best political traitorship in history in the Philippines. But the thing that people are gripping with right now, and I hope that you guys could search about this and learn about it on your own, is that even with that traitorship, right? You see that the Marcos family is very vulnerable. You have Duterte still being so popular, even though he's in prison in the Hague, in the ICC, and he's still going through trial, which is going to take many, many years, and he's not going to come back to the Philippines. And you simultaneously have Sara Duterte about to go through impeachment, but right now, when you look at the people that just won the midterm election, he is predicted to not get impeached for sure. And so, upcoming in the 2028 elections, which is 3 years from now, but the campaigning is probably going to start like 2 years from now, or like maybe even next year. Campaigning is probably already going to begin. What you're going to see is that it's very, very clear that this rift between the presidency and the vice presidency is going to mean that Marcos is going to lose power faster than not. And that's a very, very big worry in terms of the stability of the Philippine political system in the next medium to short term. Okay? I needed to say that because it's part of the debate. It's part of like some questions that you might have in mind. Okay? Are there any questions at this point? I've hopefully discussed a lot of the main concepts on political dynasties in full. Obviously, you can research this on your own however you want. But yeah, that should be good. Um, sorry, I'm just gonna go and refresh this. Yes, we made it. Let's freaking go! Congratulations, everyone. Thank you all. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for helping me reach 3,000 subscribers. We've made it. We've made it. Let's freaking go. 3K. I love it. I love it. Um, sorry. Yeah, no, thanks for having me, guys. Sorry if I lecture in a very unconventional way. Because it's really just how I like talking about things rather than just matter dumping or just having long PowerPoints that I'm reading from. Have a great day, guys. Thank you and enjoy. If you have any questions, you can send it to me personally if you want. But yeah, we should be good for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the lecture. We're super duper grateful for it. I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope everyone else did as well. Yeah, we'll be publishing the recording of this very very soon. Luigi, I think you'll share the doc with me, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. You're right. Yeah, I have to share the document. Yeah. Yeah, I'll do it right now. I'll send it before I forget. My apologies.
No issues. I'll send over the document to the main group as well so that everyone can view it. Yeah, he has sent it on the Meet chat itself, so that's great. Thank you so much for doing this. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Goodbye, everyone. Good night. See you guys.
Good night.